Rüberbländen, so we switched to English because of our guests today. Sorry. So, welcome all to our Gatherland. As you can see, we're not used to having so many people around here. Normally we're around 10 to 12 people with our Gatherland, talking about, well, science fiction, horror, fantasy. Sometimes we have guests, like we have today. So it's a big event. It's very nice to have you all here. There are drinks, a little difficult to get to them, but well, probably you can make a little break after some time, or when you can ask someone in front of you to pass through a beer or something non-alcoholic.
Yeah, so we exchanged emails with Charlie, and we told him that it's just yeah, like a coffee clutch,
Informal
sort of thing. But normally a coffee clutch is with yeah, 12 people or something like that. So I hope you're comfortable if you with all these people.
Yep, I'm comfortable enough. Can you folks at the back in the English fantasy section hear me? Good. I was a bit worried about that.
So, yeah, let's open the evening.
We can still move a bit forward. We can do that.
And the idea behind is that Charlie just talks a bit about whatever he likes, and you ask him whatever you like, and so yeah, we can just chat a little. Thank you.
Yeah, please welcome Charles Stross.
Thank you for inviting me here, and it's a pleasure to be here. I hope your English is better than my German, which is non-existent. This is why I'm travelling with my wife, who has some German. Yeah, I'm in Berlin partly because I needed a vacation. I've just redrafted 2 novels in the past 3 months. I need a little bit of time off before I redraft the next 2. And also partly for a research trip. The implication of 4 novels isn't a mistake. Part of it is an entire trilogy, or rather it's a really big 1,000-page book that'll be split into 3 volumes for publication in the United Kingdom and America. And bits of it are actually set in Berlin, so good excuse for coming here. When you read an author's work, you're always reading stuff that the author finished with some years ago. When a book of mine actually comes out in print, it has typically taken a publisher a year to produce it, to typeset it, to edit it, to look for all the typos, fix them, and introduce new typos. And this is on top of the year or so it took me to write beforehand. Sometimes I can write really fast, and sometimes it takes a bit longer. Currently, my extreme records are 18 days to write the first draft of a novel, and 5.5 years to write the first draft of a novel.
Can I ask which one will the short and...
Oh yeah, the short one hasn't come out yet. It's called the Annihilation Score. It's the 6th Laundry Files novel and comes out next July. And the long one was Accelerando, which was prodigiously hard to write. Luckily, I did other things in the meantime. But a side effect of this is the view you get of what an author writes is always skewed several years behind what they're doing now. I've been lately going around telling people that this decade I'm writing urban fantasy.
This decade.
It's not entirely untrue either. I'm currently writing new Laundry Files novels. I don't know how many people here have read the Atrocity Archives or the sequels. I see a fair number of hands going up. I'm currently in the middle of a patch of writing 1 a year. The first of which, the Rhesus Chart, came out this summer. In case you don't know about the Laundry Files, they're from the point of view of Bob Howard, an agent of a British government secret agency for dealing with Lovecraftian horrors. They're There are an awful lot of committee meetings involved in saving the world from destruction by many tentacled monsters from beyond space-time. And the opening of the Rhesus chart is... Bob is married to Mo, who is another laundry agent, and they're having dinner, and "Don't be silly, Bob," said Mo. "Everybody knows vampires don't exist." And it should be no surprise that the material of the Rhesus chart is, well, it's a vampire novel. The new one, the Annihilation Score, is the superhero novel. The one I write after that, which I'm beginning work on now, the Nightmare Stacks, these are all named after document archives, is about elves.
In Berlin.
No. Berlin is an entirely different book. For my sins, I've actually agreed to write a book a year simultaneously for 2 different publishers. The other publisher, Tor, who've published my Merchant Princes series, which have never been published in German, just taken a new Merchant Princes trilogy set in the near future. It's in a universe where we have a multiverse with various parallel universes, different timelines where history has taken different courses. And some people have the ability to travel from one timeline to another. It started out in the first book about 7 or 8 years ago, looking a little like fantasy, which is why Tor pulled out all the stops to market it as high fantasy, which it isn't. It's really alternate history, science fiction thrillers. The new series is sort of set in the near future, around the year 2020, in a universe where, never mind 9/11, the United States was slightly traumatized in 2003 when nuclear weapons stolen from their own inactive inventory were used to assassinate the president by a bunch of extra-dimensional narco-terrorists. You know, if you can hop from one timeline to another with stuff in your pockets, how do you make money? Well, you can get heroin from Central America into the United States without ever passing a border checkpoint or being stopped by the police. And if in that other world which you're using for travel without being intercepted, it's pretty much a medieval setting, they have not developed anything in the way of technology, your merchant columns are escorted by guys with M16 rifles. You're going to be pretty rich in both timelines. And then when some spoilsport tells the Drug Enforcement Agency what's going on and the US government begins to investigate this stuff, everything goes to hell in a handbasket rather fast. That's pretty much the pitch for the first series. The new trilogy I'm working on is set sort of in the year 2020 in a rather unpleasant future. Let's put it this way. One of the viewpoint characters is a member of the last Stasi spy ring to be left on American soil in 1989 before the wall came down. And those records having been burnt, he does what any spy on foreign soil does when the country he spies for has ceased to exist. He just goes underground and gets on with his life. His life is getting on pretty much as you'd expect when his adoptive granddaughter is made a job offer she's not allowed to refuse by an American government agency. And as he remarks to the camera or the reader at one point, the best possible training for life in the United States of 2020 is to have grown up in the GDR. There is no political subtext whatsoever to this book. It is absolutely not my big fat post-Edward Snowden techno-thriller. And that's the other thing I'm currently working on. So, you know, when I tell people I'm writing urban fantasy this decade, it's sort of being a bit economical with the truth, but it's more accurate than saying I'm writing space opera this decade. And now I'm thinking I should see if anybody here has come with any particular questions they want to ask me.
Why lobsters?
Oh, hell. Now we're going back to 1998. The lobster thing came out of a very condensed, very weird period in my life, because in the late 90s I was doing software development work, And I accidentally got hired as the first programmer at a .com in late 1997. We may forget that in the early days of the web, it was very difficult to buy stuff online because you couldn't pay for anything. So the company I worked for, DataCash, was set up to take credit card payments over the internet. And in the late 90s, things were a bit busy and a bit hectic. The company was growing at 30% compound growth per month for 9 consecutive months. It was a bit stressful. There was this blistering sense of high-speed change. And the reason for the lobsters in Lobsters, the story, was actually a bunch of reading I'd been doing in my spare time to keep from going insane. I discovered that researchers had in fact mapped out the neural circuitry of a particular neural plexus in the stomach of the Californian spiny lobster. This is a particular... Okay, the lobster chews its food with its stomach. Lobsters are weird that way. And the chewing mechanism is controlled by a network of 26 really big neurons that interconnect in a very regular manner. And the whole mind uploading thing, everybody here who's interested in lobsters familiar with the idea of mind uploading? That we can map the connectome of the brain and run you as software in a computer? Well, the first step is obviously you upload something much simpler than a human brain. You upload a lobster. Better still, you upload the stomach of a lobster. And you regression test your model of how the stomach control neurons of the lobster work using microelectrodes connected to the stomatogastric ganglion, as it's called, of a real lobster in a Petri dish. Lobster ain't there anymore, but its neural plexus that controls its stomach is alive. And it turns out that they had sufficiently accurately mapped and simulated this neural plexus that if they killed one particular nerve in a real one and replaced that nerve with electrodes powered by the simulation of it they were running in a computer, the neural nexus worked as it should. So it seemed obvious to me you start, if you're going to go the mind uploading route, by uploading something simple like lobsters. Of course, when you have lobster brains hooked into Google, strange things begin happening, and that story, Lobsters, which was shortlisted for the Nebula and Hugo Awards and is the first chapter of Accelerando, I basically had to write that story or have a nervous breakdown because of what I was doing at the office at the time. It was a deeply uncomfortable, deeply weird period to live through. And I won't be going there again because I have no intention whatsoever of becoming programmer #1 at another .com. I'm too old for that shit.
Do you have any influence on covers from other language editions? Really, I have to ask the German version of Holding State.
Mm-hmm.
The cover is really terrible. Because the German cover looks like Grand Theft Auto.
Yes, it's inspired. It's brilliant. It's a novel about criminal activities committed in computer games.
Unlike anything like GTA, and in my opinion, it offers a completely wrong expectation of the whole story. And the title, "You Are Dead," I exactly cannot easily translate Holding State to a understandable German term. But the whole cover idea, I don't know what's.
Okay, any book cover, being really cynical and explaining from a point of view of a publisher's marketing person, the purpose of a book cover is not to accurately represent what is in the book. The purpose of a book cover is to make somebody in a shop who has never heard of the author before pick up the book. People who have heard of the author or know the book will buy it anyway. Wait, or not. But people who've never heard of the author might pick up an interesting looking cover. And there are studies by psychologists working in the retail trade that show customers in shops are more likely to buy a product if they've picked it up and held it. That's all there is to it.
Yeah, but I get the idea, but
That is not my worst cover by a very, very long way.
What is your worst cover?
My worst covers... Okay, there are some Russian books that I have heard about, but my Russian publishers never send me copies, so I am blissfully unaware of a true horror. But there is... I am published in the Czech Republic, and Czech book covers are special. In particular, they bought the rights to the Merchant Princes series I was discussing, and while the Americans mismarketed it initially as a fantasy series, although they're repackaging them as techno-thrillers now, the Czechs very creatively marketed the first book with the sort of soft-focus romance cover that got it misfiled in half the bookshops in Prague, according to one of my fans there. And it's probably not a good book to misfile under romance, because while there is a strong female protagonist, her love interest is machine-gunned to death in front of her at the end of book 2. Now, authors are expected to hate their book covers. This is normal. What is not normal is when the author's literary agent throws a tantrum when she sees the book cover. At that point, the publisher usually pays attention. Agents are supposed to be cold-blooded publishing professionals like them. It's a sign of their concern that the Czech publisher already had book 2 in production, but they went back and got the artist to alter the cover for book 2. Which is why there are 2 ladies in Victorian dress on the cover, one of whom appears to be holding an automatic pistol. And it's a very creative addition, because if you look at the book cover, I wish I had brought a copy along with me, you will see that the right arm in which she is holding the pistol has 2 elbows and a left hand. Finally, the worst American cover I've got, I think there might be a copy of the American edition of Saturn's Children on the sale stuff there. The cover I refer to as the purple-haired space bimbo.
Yeah.
Very mid-80s Heinlein.
There's a reason for that. I wrote that novel in the centenary of Robert Heinlein's birth as the Charlie Stross Heinlein tribute novel. Now, a lot of authors write Heinlein tribute novels. John Scalzi, John Varley, Spider Robinson, who else? Everybody does it, and they uniformly do one thing wrong. Their Heinlein tribute novel is always a Heinlein juvenile or young adult novel. Fuck that. I was going to write a dirty old man Heinlein tribute novel. Because, you know, nobody else is doing it. And having read far too much Heinlein for my own good, I've always had a soft spot for his novel Friday. Which seemed to me to be a novel that could have benefited from better editing. Cough. My editor for Saturn's Children was the editor who had worked on Friday. Hence the cover she had done specially to echo the original cover of the novel. Very mid-80s American. I don't know. Do you want me to talk for a little bit about Saturn's Children?
Sure.
Well, okay. Late period Heinlein, the dirty old man period. Everybody familiar with late period Heinlein? In late period Heinlein, a very, very common fictional trope that is encountered almost nowhere else in fiction, thank goodness, is the nipple that goes spung. We, in the reality-based community, know that human nipples do not make a noise like spung. But obviously they do in Heinlein novels. So we need to find out why a nipple might make this strange noise, and the only answer I could come up with was it's not attached to a human being. It's obviously got to be attached to a robot. But why would a robot have nipples? The only logical answer I could come up with was that it was a sex robot. Now, Heinlein said there are only 3 basic plots. The Brave Little Tailor, The Man Who Learnt Better, and Boy Meets Girl. So I got a dice and I rolled it, and as luck would have it, it came up with the Brave Little Tailor, the one where the protagonist goes walkabout, has lots of adventures, learns stuff about themselves. And there is a problem. If a protagonist you have selected is a sex robot, then you don't have much of a plot because most of the time they're going to be staring at the ceiling. So something must have gone wrong so that they can have adventures. And the obvious reason why a sex robot might be running around the solar system having adventures is quite simple. They came off a production line 6 months after the human species went extinct. And this is where that novel came from. And if you think this is very silly, so do I. Anyway, the reason it got that cover, they were trying to pay a tribute to the original Heinlein cover for Friday, which is not that dissimilar. Unfortunately, I saw that cover and I kicked up a fuss. But they overruled me because the bigger the publisher, the less say the author has over the cover. In a small publisher like Golden Griffin, hi Charlie, here is your artist, here are some ideas we've got, would you like to see a few rough drafts of the cover? Whereas with a publisher like Ace, which is part of Random Penguin, or Penguin Random House as they're officially called, hi Charlie, here's your new book cover. Everybody here in the office really likes it. What do you think? And, you know, if you're really enthusiastic about your book covers, they gradually go to assume that, yeah, you're actually a sane human being and not an author. And therefore, when you object to a book cover, they might listen once, but then it resets the clock. And I had raised serious objections to the cover of Halting State the year before. So when I objected to Saturn's Children, they said, tough, you're getting the purple-haired space bimbo. Now, the reason I objected to the cover of Halting State, well, you haven't seen the version that they corrected for me. Suffice to say, it's a Scottish crime novel, so they decided to put a city skyline on the cover and some British police insignia on the cover, and they put the London skyline and the Scotland Yard insignia on the cover. I had to sort of explain, no, this is like putting an LAPD patrol car in Times Square with the Washington Monument in the background. They grumbled, but they did go back to the cover designer and put in the Walter Scott Monument from Edinburgh and a Lothian and Borders, that's the Scottish Police Force badge. But no, thereafter I was pigeonholed as one of those awkward authors who objects to us getting their book covers wrong. So you see, the problem with book covers is they're not meant to represent the interior of a book accurately. The bigger the publisher, the less input the author has on the cover. And if the author does kick up a fuss in one book, they might get their own way, but the next book, they'll be lucky.
What about the titles?
Titles? Oh. It varies. Sometimes the title comes first and the book is absolutely about the title and cannot be changed. And sometimes, I don't care, figure out a better title for me, please. I do not have any actual authority over the title a book comes out under, but usually the title I suggest is the title it comes out with. There are exceptions. My first novel was published as Singularity Sky. It was originally titled Festival of Fools. The reason it was retitled was because, firstly, Richard Paul Russo had a book called Ship of Fools, out from the same publisher, and marketing were afraid it would cause confusion. Secondly, my editor got the message and then said, right, Charlie, we need a new title. Can it have the singularity word in it? That's hot right now. This was in 2002. And all we could agree on was Singularity Sky. So I sort of got pigeonholed as the Singularity guy right from the outset, sort of like being the talking cat guy. A bit embarrassing, really. there are other cases where I've had titles changed. My short story collection, Wireless, was originally going to be titled Palimpsest, after the novella at the end of it, but Catherine Valente just had an award-winning novel titled Palimpsest come out right then. So it would have been a bit embarrassing to have the same title, even though she was with another publisher. So we changed it, which led then to the Hugo ceremony in 2010 having nominations for Best Novella, Palimpsest. Nominations for Best Novel, Palimpsest. Usually my suggestions go ahead. I have had a new change, though. Next year's novel from Ace and Orbit, the Laundry novel, is going to be titled The Annihilation Score. It was originally going to be titled The Armageddon Score, but then my young, dynamic, new British editor, Jenny, looked it up in Google and discovered that if you Google for Armageddon Score, you get the musical soundtrack to the movie Armageddon starring Bruce Willis. So I'm now having my titles changed because a search engine gives the wrong hits. It's all about marketing. I'm in control of the contents of a novel. I don't have any control over the cover of a title. Or the price, for that matter. Huh? Oh, sorry. Anyway. Yeah. Do we have another question? Or... Yes, Echoid was fun to write. Echoid, my Laundry Files novella that won the Hugo this year. It actually took me about 4 or 5 years to get around to it, because rewind to, I think, 2008, the World Science Fiction Convention in Denver, Colorado. I was at the convention, and Peter Watts had been there, and we'd been chatting about sexual dimorphism in deep-sea fish and marine parasitology, because Peter's a biologist and likes this sort of stuff, and some of it's really gruesome. And we'd been talking about this when, later that day, I was in a hotel bar at the convention, and John Scalzi walks in, talking to SF editor Lou Anders. And... okay. Going by their body language, John was very animatedly trying to sell something to Lou. He was pitching. You got to buy this story. It's a really good idea. You'll love it. Your readers will buy millions of it. And Lou's body language was, get away from me, you creep. And you know, this is John Scalzi, who by this time is already a multi-award-winning best-selling author. So I get curious, and I've had a couple of pints of beer anyway. So I shamble over and say, hi, John, hi, Lou. And Lou just looks at me and says, he's trying to sell me a theme anthology and I'm not buying it. Oh? What's the theme, John? What are you trying to sell Lou that he won't... what are you trying to sell to Lou that he won't buy? And John just smirks. What's he trying to sell you? And finally I get the story out of him. He's trying to sell me a theme anthology of unicorn bukkake stories. Now, you've got to remember, I'd had a couple of pints of beer. We were at 1.5 kilometres altitude above sea level, so it had hit me a bit hard. And I'd been brainstorming parasitology ideas with Peter Watts. Because at that point, a light bulb went on over my head, and I suddenly realised, hang on, sexual dimorphism, horn, horse, anglerfish, unicorn. Guys, I've got a story for you. And they both turned to me and said, get away from me, you creep. Because what had occurred to me was unicorns, well, anglerfish were for many years thought to be, the males and females were thought to be two different species. The males were so much smaller and stranger shaped than the females, deep sea anglerfish. And it was finally discovered how they mate. Males swim up to a female, bite a warty protuberance on her head, and merge. Their circulatory systems fuse. The female gradually digests the male until he's just a wart. Meanwhile, sperm are released through the shared blood circulation. Yeah. And I suddenly realised, cone snail, horse, the horse is the female juvenile phase, chomp, unicorn. And then it turned into a tale of terror. Many, many, many years ago, I had a relationship with a farmer's daughter. And there's all sorts of obscure British cultural references relating to farming and agricultural folk in Echoid. I have no idea what the Chinese translator has made of all this. But that's the first of a new sequence, well, nearly the first of a new sequence in the Laundry Files where I pivot to pastiching urban fantasy subgenres. The earlier ones were all based on specific British authors of Cold War spy thrillers. I did Len Dayton, I did Ian Fleming and James Bond, and so on. I got bored after 4 books. So the new series, there's Echoid, which is the unicorn novella, the Rhesus Chart, which is the vampire novel. As I said, the Annihilation Score is superheroes. And the next one I write is going to be about elves. And it is also the one in which I destroy the city of my birth, Leeds. As my American editor asked, Charlie, okay, it's traditional for authors to destroy their hometown, but normally they do it in the first novel. Aren't you leaving it a bit late?
Could you do me a favour and destroy Harrogate as well, please?
I'll get to that in a moment. But my response was, well, yeah, but I believe in delayed gratification. I think I can probably get Harrogate within the blast radius of a fallout plume of a nuke. Also, I decided that for elves, I mean, this is primarily a Lovecraftian series. And what I'm going for isn't literal unicorns or vampires, but the sort of the hideous underlying reality that the legends refer to in garbled form. Elves in the Laundry universe aren't really fairies. They aren't the fair folk. They aren't the Seelie and the unseelie courts. It's more a case of, imagine you live in a village and one of your neighbours, who's an illiterate peasant goat herd, has been kidnapped by American special forces and dragged downhill to Kandahar, where they've questioned him about the Taliban. And he didn't know anything, so they turned him loose. And you're another Afghan hill farmer, and you're talking to your neighbour who's been taken away by these insane weird people with magic powers and then released, and you're trying to deduce the internals of Beltway politics in Washington, D.C. from an illiterate Afghan hill farmer. No, elves in the Laundry universe are very, very bad news indeed. And they're getting ready to invade. And that's actually my next book project, so I probably shouldn't say too much more about it. Except there is a building in Leeds called Quarry House. It's a government building on a hill in the centre of town. And it's not merely ominous. The architecture is of a style that has been called fascist baroque. And it's designed as a regional centre of continuity of government after a nuclear war. But it has a rather unsavoury legacy because it replaced an earlier building that had been designated in 1940 as the Gestapo headquarters for England. Yeah, so the Department of Social Security uses this as its base now. And for one reason or another, the Laundry have decided they need this as their new headquarters. It's not going to last long enough to be much use to them.
So what is a typical day for you if you do your writing? What is happening if Charles Stross is writing his books?
There's no such thing as a typical day, but usually what happens is I get up, I wake up, surf the web for too long, go to the gym at the top of the road and swim half a kilometre, because otherwise I probably die too early and don't finish the book.
Don't die.
Yeah, that's rule number 1. Don't die. Everything else comes second. Come home, have some lunch, and then sit down in front of the computer and hope that sooner or later some words appear. If I'm not lucky, it's a blog entry or too much time on Reddit. If I'm lucky, then I accidentally omit some text. When things are going really smoothly, I'm putting out a couple of thousand words a day that takes 2 to 4 hours work, but it's the sort of head-down intensive work. You do 2 to 4 hours at that level and you're just drained, and that's it for the day. You know how in most workplaces you're not working flat out 8 or 9 hours a day. You've probably got a couple of hours of hard work. It's like that step constantly. When things go badly, that's when I sit down at the keyboard around 11 AM and then keel over at 8 PM and there's 7,000 or 8,000 words there. I go to the pub to drink beer until my brain shuts down, then I go home and do it again for 2 or 3 consecutive weeks. I say bad because that's a good way to violate Rule 1. It happened last year when I accidentally wrote the Annihilation Score. I say accidentally, I wasn't meant to be writing this book back then. It was on my to-do list, but first I went to Australia for a guest of honour invite to an SF convention. Now, you don't go to Australia for a weekend convention from Scotland. You go to Australia for a weekend convention, spend a few days sightseeing in Perth, and then you fly home, via Kuala Lumpur, where you take 3 weeks to change planes. And, you know, I'd never visited Malaysia before, and it was very interesting, and while I'm doing that sort of thing, I don't write, because, you know, I feel guilty about holing up in a hotel room to write fiction the whole time while I'm in Malaysia. So I came home, and because it was that time of year, I sat down to do my taxes, because one does one's taxes, and a week later I had to go out to a literary conference in Estonia, and while I was in Estonia, I woke up one morning and my face was half paralysed. Now, I was 5 minutes into doing my web research to confirm whether or not I'd had a stroke when I realised I was able to talk fine and both hands were working, so it was just my face. There's a condition called Bell's palsy. It's caused when one of the cranial nerves behind the ear becomes inflamed and your face just droops on one side, and it clears up after a few weeks. But in the meantime, you can't blink properly, so your eyes are watering the whole time, and you're drooling and you're gurning like a pirate. Arr. So I spent a month on the road to Malaysia and Australia, then a couple of weeks doing taxes or at a writers' conference in Estonia, and then another 3 or 4 weeks being ill, barely able to read, never mind write. And so this is 2 months of Charlie being enforceably unable to write. I woke up the day after the palsy wore off enough that I could blink normally at 4 minutes past midnight with my head spinning. And I went downstairs to my study and began writing, and she'd been out at a party and came home at 4 or 5 AM and I was still writing. I went to bed for a few hours, got up, carried on writing. At 24 hours in, there were 11,000 words. At 167 hours in, that's 1 hour less than 1 week, I'd written 51,000 words. That's NaNoWriMo in less than a week. I kept on going till I hit the end of a novel at 109,000 words in 18 days. But I think I spent a couple of days in bed. This doesn't happen very often, but the problem is the laundry files are an established setting. I'd already written 5 books in the series, and when you're doing superheroes, the jokes just write themselves. Now, there is a problem with just writing at that pace. You get exhausted towards the end. As it turned out, I had to redraft it a couple of months ago, and I just had to chop the last 10,000 words and redo completely because the ending was weak. I replaced that 10,000 words with 30,000 words and a much better ending, and now it's a fairly solid book, and it will be out next July. And if any of you have read the Laundry Files novels before, all of them, all the other novels, up to and including the Rhesus Chart, are narrated by Bob Howard. This one is told by Mo. I'm not going to say any more than that.
You forgot Minut's contribution to your creative process.
Oh, yeah, the cat. I have a cat, and when I don't pay her attention, first she gets between me and the keyboard or screen, and then she starts biting my hands. This is a little bit problematic.
You live in Edinburgh, right?
Yes.
Is there any cultural interchange with the other science fiction writers that live there or thereabouts? Like Ian Banks used to live close.
Yeah, Ian Banks lived about 10-12 kilometres out of town in North Queensferry. I saw him from time to time, but sort of a guy I meet at the pub sometimes. Ken MacLeod I know a lot better. He lives in South Queensferry on the other side of the river, and we get together for drinks every month or two. Hannu Rajaniemi, the Finnish writer, has just moved to San Francisco but was in Edinburgh for many years. He wrote The Quantum Thief, among other things. We used to get together for drinks or for coffee quite regularly and to brainstorm stuff. There is an Edinburgh SF Writers Workshop that we were both in for quite a long time, and it's still going. There are quite a few... Edinburgh's a city of only 500,000 people. There are quite a lot of SF and fantasy writers there for the population. And we do sort of cross-fertilise and exchange ideas periodically. But it's nothing on the same scale as, for example, London. Simply because of the scale factor, it's a much smaller city. The odd thing about the Scottish scene is there's a lot of writers in Glasgow as well, and there's relatively little interchange. You've got, over there, you've got Richard Morgan, you've got Hal Duncan, I forget who else, Grant Morrison on the graphic novel side. But Edinburgh and Glasgow are difficult to get between. There are trains that take about 40 minutes, but you first have to get into the city centre and agree to meet people. Don't even think about driving. There is a jokingly named motorway between the two cities, but these cities basically predate the automobile and haven't really been redesigned for automobiles. Last time we went to a concert in Glasgow, it literally took 2.5 hours to drive over there. A distance of about 60 kilometres.
I think this is unfair because they are actually upgrading the so-called motorway to proper motorway, and that's part of the problem. It's just roadworks now while they rebuild it.
For several years. Yeah. But yeah, there is a cultural life. There's a lot more connectedness in the non-science fiction and fantasy literary scene in Edinburgh, which is a designated UNESCO City of Literature. So
did you meet Ian Rankin? And
yeah.
other people?
Yeah, I've met Ian Rankin and quite a few others. I wouldn't say I know them well, because the issue with Ian Rankin, or Ian Banks, the late Ian Banks for that matter, is fame. When people become famous, it's very difficult for them to socialise with people who they didn't know before they became famous, or with people who aren't themselves famous, because they're surrounded by people the whole time.
Now, you recognised on the street in Edinburgh? Are you being stopped and said, hey?
Occasionally, very occasionally. Usually I can be anonymous, but I am sometimes recognised, and it's always slightly disturbing when that happens. Hell, I was silent for a bit, though, when deciding whether or not I could violate somebody's privacy by recounting an anecdote about somebody famous, and then what the hell. You know the anecdote from a certain concert a few years ago?
Oh, that one.
Yeah. My wife and I have been going to Dresden Dolls and Amanda Palmer concerts for ages, about a decade plus. And it helps to know that I've been going to British science fiction conventions for a third of a century. Indeed, one of my first SF conventions was a British Eastercon around 1984. Picture the scene. There is a 19-year-old Charlie Stross, a nerd with a carrier bag with a manuscript in it, looking for an editor to pester. And also walking around at this convention with about 1,000 other fans, there is this 20-something tall goth guy in drainpipe jeans, all in black, mirror shades, long hair, called Neil, who writes for a comic called 2000 AD, but has this idea for a new strip called The Sandman. And at the bar, hanging out at the bar, is this mid-30s guy. He's a writer, he's got a bushy beard and wears a hat, and buy me a pint of beer and I'll tell you all about my new novel. Oh yeah, I'm a real published fantasy writer, you know. My latest novel has just come out. It's called The Colour of Magic. Anyway, this is by way of explaining that I first met Neil Gaiman in the mid-1980s. And about 3-4 years ago, my wife and I go to an Amanda Palmer gig in Edinburgh at a venue for about 1,000 people, and she goes on stage with her band, and they're blasting into the first song when this figure turns up at my elbow and says, mind if I hang out here? And it is, of course, Neil. And the reason he is there is simply because it's somebody he's known for years who isn't going to do the fanboy thing at him. And I get a snapshot of the fame thing at the end, because the lights come up at the end of the concert. And we're chatting for a couple of minutes when all of a sudden I realise that people surrounding us are beginning to turn towards us like this. And it's like being inside Night of the Living Dead if the zombies were all holding autograph books and pens. If you are truly famous for George R.R. Martin or Neil Gaiman or Terry Pratchett's levels of fame, you can't have a normal social life in public. Because whatever you do, you'll be interrupted by strangers. It must be 1,000 times worse to actually be a Hollywood star or a television star, or for that matter, a front-rank politician. Actually, politicians may be worse. Politics has been described as Hollywood celebrity culture for ugly people, and you'll have people who want to have words with you because they hate you, not just because they're your fans. Yeah, politics is probably worse. But I'd like you to imagine for a moment not being able to go anywhere without being recognised and having people you don't know want some time. I get a taste of it at big science fiction conventions, where if I'm standing in the middle of a concourse at a Worldcon, I cannot stand still for 5 minutes without somebody coming up to me. But at least I can turn it off. Real fame you can keep. That's not fun at all. How long have I been talking, and can I have a beer? Oops. Right.
So I remember the first time you came into, I think it was the first time you came into our shop, and you just walked by. So I think it was me, or did I get a sort of, I think I was standing here, and you just walked by back, and it was, oh, that was, it looked like, So I think you came back and you asked, do you want to sign my books? I said, you are? Yeah.
Well, I popped in because he hadn't got... Heine hadn't sent him his author copies of his latest book, and so I was there looking for it, so because he could get hold of the copy.
Yeah, that's it. So it was just so funny, because normally you're just like, whoa, there's a famous author coming in, so like, walk just by.
Now, I have to be more careful about that sort of thing these days, because there's a very odd thing that's been happening in the past couple of years, There are a couple of specialist SF bookshops in Edinburgh, and one of them in particular, Forbidden Planet, has been plagued by imposters coming in and claiming to be authors so they can get a discount. In particular, I'm told by the book buyer there was one occasion when I caused some embarrassment because my wife and I were walking around looking at graphic novels to buy, and the shop staff were, or so I'm told, busy ejecting a tall, skinny, blonde Charlie Stross who's 30 years too young, who'd been trying to get a discount on some stuff he wanted to buy.
So one time a guy came in, was standing here, and I just looked, whoa, Samuel L. Delaney just walked by. I was calling my son and said, I think Samuel R. Delaney is in the shop. I said, ask him. So I went there. Excuse me, are you? Nope. So that's the other thing around that could happen.
Yeah. So, I have heard of some authors on occasion being ejected from shops for offering to sign stock because the staff didn't believe who they were. So, it's best these days always to email in advance. Or to be anonymous. The mystery author.
We had a party here once where somebody approached me and said, there's a guy back there defacing your books, which was Joe Hill signing his German novels. Please get rid of him.
And I was the bouncer at the entrance, and I thought he's just a college guy. I wanted to get in. I said, "Sorry, it's closed here." And he said, "Okay, I go somewhere else." And someone was whispering in my ear, "That's Joe Hill." And, oh, okay, get in. Could happen too. So, do you get recognized here in Germany?
Virtually never.
Oh, nice.
Which, as I've said, is fine by me. It is particularly weird being noticed on the streets in a foreign country.
Oh, yeah.
It last happened in Dublin in August. We were just on our way out to a restaurant somewhere where we were just walking along a street in the centre of Dublin. We were there because of the Eurocon was there. But we weren't at the convention or anywhere near it. And so a random passerby said, "Oh my God, you're Charlie Stross. I read all your books." And when that happens on a street, it's really quite disconcerting.
Or when you're just trying to buy something in John Lewis.
Oh, yeah. Local department store. Mind you, it's happened the other way around. The last time I saw Ian Banks was in John Lewis, believe it or not. It was shortly...
Outside, it was in St James Centre.
In the shopping centre it's attached to. He was just in town to buy something. You just run into... If you live in the city where somebody famous lives and you know who they are or you know them, you will on occasion run into them. But actually, I think this topic is getting a bit mundane and off-topic.
Can you maybe talk a bit about your writing process? In terms of...
process.
No, I mean, whatever it is, because it's for example, certain writers have a pretty disciplined schedule in terms of writing specific days for a certain length.
I'm an anarchist. Or rather, I've outsourced all the organisational stuff to software. Now, all novels are different. What usually happens is I have a bunch of ideas that I'm kicking around for quite a long time before I begin writing them. It is vanishingly rare for me to sit down and start writing a novel cold without having thought about it for a few years first. Partly, this is because of the way publishers work. Publishers don't buy novels, they buy careers. They will usually try and buy 2 or 3 books at a time on contract in advance, and they like books to be sequels to existing properties because it makes it much easier for the editor to convince their marketing people to take the book and how to sell it. So, I know, for example, that I'm contracted to write a Laundry Files novel that must be handed in by November the 1st next year. Because it's written on this multi-page document that I signed with a contract and money payable on it. which is a nice way to work, but it does sort of restrict the creative side a bit. I know what ideas are going into that laundry novel. I've been sort of gathering stuff and putting them into a mental scrapbook, as it were, for years. And when the time comes to write it, I can just basically sit down and start. If I run short on stuff, or if there are holes in my vision of what it should be, I probably hole up with some beer and some friends for a while and sort of brainstorm at them, because for some reason people like hearing me talk about what I'm thinking of writing. Now, the actual writing process itself, there's a software tool I use these days called Scrivener. I do not use Microsoft Word if I can avoid it. Scrivener is a tool written for writing long compound documents like novels. It's basically a novel writing tool. Are there any software programmers in the house? A few. Okay. Scrivener is to Microsoft Word as an integrated development environment is to a text editor. That sort of explains it to programmers. To people who don't know what text editors or integrated development environments are, I'm sorry, that's not much help, but it would take me half an hour to demonstrate it.
Except that unlike Microsoft Word, text editors don't crash all the fucking time. You've got a really long document.
Yeah, and neither does Scrivener. More to the point, Scrivener makes it very, very easy to refactor a novel, to mess around with its deep structure, to rearrange plot threads, and basically keep track of the stuff that goes into a really long book. Because I'm afraid I'm 50 and my memory is not what it ought to be. I can't do this sort of thing the hard way anymore. Now, there are exceptions. I woke up in a cold sweat one day in March this year when I realised everything I had written since 2008 was in series with something I had begun before that year. That's in a 5-year period with no creative freedom. With no clean sheets. So, of course, over the next 24 hours, I am attacked by a fantasy novel. An attack novel is a bit like an attack dog. It bites you and won't let go. I have not written this novel, because if I were to do so, I would be in breach of contract and editors would yell at me. Justifiably so, as would my agent. I meant to write the stuff they've paid for first, because, you know, they've paid me money for it. So this novel does not exist, and the fact that there are 25,000 words of notes and another 25,000 words of development of written material is not a novel, honest. It will not be a novel until I've finished all the stuff I've got under contract and have another month or so to put it all together. But Gothic haunted house novels. Because I haven't written one yet.
So the fantasy novel will be about what?
It's a haunted house novel about mortgage anxiety among the millennial generation in the year 2030.
Where do you get your
A Gothic novel.
Where do you get your inspiration from? It sounds like news. And...
Oh my god.
Sorry, I'm not a writer.
You know James Blaylock? It came from Schenectady.
Yeah.
That's always what I think.
I thought he stole that one from... I forget whether it was Harlan Ellison or Roger Zelazny who said that they send a check to a post office box somewhere and a month later they get back this neatly handwritten sheet with a whole bunch of ideas on it. Or a saucer full of milk and some sugar lumps outside the back door at night. Ideas are actually the easy bit. Anyone can come up with ideas and brainstorm them. You just get a whole bunch of random stuff and throw it together and see what seems to fit. The problem is execution. Making a novel from a bunch of ideas is much, much, much harder than coming up with the ideas. It's one of these things that gets easier with practice, but it's an insane sort of thing to want to practice to begin with, because it takes so long. Before I was able to do it full time for a living, I was taking on average about 3 years to write a book. This is while having a day job. The fact that I'm now able to do up to 2 books a year tells you something about the amount of work that goes into them.
Speaking of ideas and creativity, you made a book together with
Cory
Doctorow, and they both seem to have pulled out any stops on crazy ideas.
Well,
it was melting that together into a novel that really works.
Yeah, that novel sort of happened by accident. We were chatting in email before we'd ever met, around 2003, and hey, why don't we collaborate on a short story? And, you know, I have play dates to collaborate on a short story with a whole bunch of writers. One of these years I meant to do something with Kat Valente, with Mike Swanwick, and or with Rudy Rucker. But we've never actually got it together to do this. The one with Cory was the one where we actually did it. And what happened was, I have a whole folder on my hard disk, or used to, where short stories went to die. These were short stories where I'd written a beginning but couldn't see how the hell to continue it. So I had the beginning of a short story about this guy who wakes up in a bathtub with a weird tattoo on his body that keeps moving around after a party. And I couldn't figure out what to do with it, but I thought, what the hell, let's see if this amuses Cory. So I emailed it to Cory, and he wrote another 1,000 words on the end of it and mailed it back to me. So I wrote 1,000 words on the end of that and mailed it back to him. And we played ping-pong with it. And a lot of the time there was a passive-aggressive subtext of, look what I've written you into now, get out of that, you. And at the end of the day, we had about 17,000 words, and it looked vaguely like a novella, so what should we do with it? Well, Ellen Datlow is buying for sci-fi.com. How about I send it to her? And lo, Ellen Datlow reads it and says, this is good, would $2,000 do? And, well, Cory and I had met by this time, but but we weren't there at the same time when this happened. Otherwise, we'd have looked at each other and said, hell yes, high fives. And that was where it rested for a year or two. Then, Lou Anders, who I've mentioned before, Unicorn Bukaki story, this is an earlier stage in his career. He is hired to edit the magazine Argosy, one of the oldest fantasy titles out there, going through one of its periodic reboots. And he has this amazing idea for design for how the magazine will be designed. It's a small, perfect bound magazine in a slipcase with a chapbook containing a novella, about 40,000 words. And he's read Jury Service, the Stross Otherland collaboration, and says, well, can you guys write me a sequel that follows on from it? And, sure, if you pay us enough. Okay, would $3,500 be enough? Yes. So then we get down and we carry on writing and we add another story to it. And there's 40,000 words, and this comes out in a shortish print run as a chapbook attached to the short-lived magazine Argosy, to issue 3, which was the final issue, titled The Rapture of the Nerds, and if you can find one, it's probably a collector's item these days. And that was where things stood for a while. However, Cory by this point was becoming a bit of a star at Tor, his American publisher. And I had a series with Tor as well, and it was during a period when I had this constant run of being on the Hugo shortlist, and evidently Tom Doherty, the CEO, got this idea that he wanted another prefab supergroup. Every generation or so, somebody gets this mad idea of organising a collaboration between two authors, and this is why you've got Dies Irae, the collaborative novel by Philip K. Dick and Roger Zelazny, The Difference Engine by William Gibson and Bruce Sterling, and now the new version of The Rapture of the Nerds by Charlie Stross and Cory Doctorow. It's because some editorial director or chief executive told his editors, we have 2 stars, why aren't they collaborating together? I'm sure we can square their sales. So we got word from our editors, Tom wants you guys to write the rest of the novel. Okay, but we've both got our own books to be writing. So for the next 3 or 4 years, every year I would email Corey and say, hi, how about this collaboration we're meant to be doing? And Corey would say, sorry, I'm kind of busy this year. Okay, me too, actually. Until in 2012, Locus ran their regular April Fool column. Locus magazine is the trade journal of the science fiction publishing field, and every April they run a series of joke news items. And in April 2012, the joke news item was Stross and Dr. O hired for 7-digit book advance to write authorised sequel to Atlas Shrugged. And yeah, I could not ignore this, and neither could Corey. And as it turned out, we had 3 months at the end of our schedule that year with nothing else planned. So that's when we buckled down and wrote the rest of the book. Oh, after turning our agents loose to see how much change we could shake out of Tom Doherty's pockets.
It wasn't a 7-figure sum.
It wasn't as... Look, if a 7-figure sum would be in the millions, no. No. We don't roll that high. But it was perfectly satisfactory. It was enough to make it worth the pain. And the thing is, when you collaborate on a novel with another author, both of you do 75% of the work. You do your half, they do their half, and then you rewrite half of their half. It is actually quite annoying. So we did, however, get through it and finish the book, and it sort of... Reading it is a really weird experience because it's not written by Charlie Stross or Cory Doctorow. It's written by some weird double-headed entity that's definitely mainlined far too much caffeine for its own good. Hmm? Ish, yeah. The thing is... he lives in London and jet sets all over the planet. His time is scheduled to the nearest millisecond. Cory isn't just a writer, and a New York Times top 10 best-selling writer at that, which I'm not. He's also a public intellectual. He's one of the mainstays of the Open Rights Group, was the Electronic Frontier Foundation's outreach director. He occasionally has academic professorial roles. He does all sorts of stuff. I don't. So his calendar is a lot busy. I'm more focused on just being a writer and hopefully on enjoying life. So I don't see him as often as I should, actually. But London is surprisingly hard to get to if you live in Edinburgh. I suspect this is probably entirely intentional on the part of the London elite. They don't want the Scots having access to them too easily. But it is literally no harder for me to get to New York than it is to get to London. Yeah. Same number of flight sectors, just a few hours longer in the air. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In that you wrote that you think that our current financial system is crap, but what you think is worse is Bitcoin actually. And I wanted to ask you what are your views on that topic right now, and does this inspire you to write more about it?
Well, I did a chunk of my topic on that in Neptune's Brood, the novel. But the thing about Bitcoin, I do not have a problem with cryptocurrencies in principle. I have a very particular problem with Bitcoin, the specific cryptocurrency. Bitcoin is unstable. My understanding is that in the long term it is deflationary unless they fork the blockchain. Basically, there's a finite limit to how many Bitcoins can ever be mined. Which means if you've got a growing economy, it's going to be deflationary beyond a certain point. We're already seeing Bitcoin as the object of currency speculation on a wild scale. It's not a stable currency if it rises and falls by 50% overnight. There's something very wrong here by design. I think Bitcoin was largely powered by the same sort of enthusiasts who were buying gold bullion a couple of years ago. They see currency as an investment vehicle rather than merely a medium of exchange, and it suggests to me a fundamental basic misunderstanding of what money is for at a very, very low level. Also, it is very common for people who are exponents of Bitcoin to be bitterly opposed to the whole idea of governments issuing money and indeed civil taxation. A lot of Bitcoin's loudest proponents want to see it used explicitly for tax evasion purposes to crash central government revenue. And it seems to me that there is a political agenda embedded in Bitcoin at a very low level, namely libertarianism. And I'm sorry, but I do not have a lot of time for these people. I come from a country, the UK, that had an experiment with libertarianism that failed spectacularly in the 1850s. In the 1850s, the UK was a libertarian night watchman state. There was no income tax. Previous to the 19th century, police were municipally funded rather than government funded, in many cases private. There was no social security system. In event of a recession, people would just die in the streets. What really did in this night watchman state, the sole purpose of funding was national security, basically running the navy. What really did it in was an event called the Great Stink of London, because the City of London had been using the River Thames as an open sewer until one particularly hot summer, the stench got so bad it forced Parliament out of London. The next year, the government approved funding for the first massive scale of public works, namely the construction of a sewer system. And there's a slippery slope down to socialism all the way from there. And whenever I hear libertarians describe their ideal political state, I just think, no, what they're calling for is mid-Victorian Britain. A country where the poor were left to die. Riot control consisted of calling in the army to open fire on crowds. Yes, we had a democracy and votes. If you were male, aged over 21 and owned land, you could vote for your MP, who you'd probably been to school with. There weren't that many people who fell in that category. No. Just say no to libertarianism. It's one of the modernist, in my view, it's one of the modernist ideologies that came along after the collapse of a monarchical system that purports to explain how to run things rationally, just like communism and fascism, except it hasn't had the chance to build pyramids of skulls, and we shouldn't give it one.
Do you ever have any arguments with Ken MacLeod about that one?
Yeah, but Ken is a very slippery character to hold political arguments with. The thing about Ken is his father was a lay preacher in a Presbyterian kirk in the Scottish Highlands. And he grew up as a fundamentalist Christian, then went to university and threw off the virus and came down with the first other virus that was going around, meaning Trotskyism. So, after a few hair-raising runs of smuggling samizdat texts into Eastern Europe for dissidents, which turned out to be funded by the CIA, no, this was British Trotskyites doing this in the 1970s, he threw off that one as well and began to question everything. And he now freely declares that it is very rare for him to go to bed with the same set of political beliefs he woke up with in the morning. However, if you want to know about arcane schismatic politics among Trotskyite and Maoist groups in the UK, he's your man. And apparently they're very, very similar in structure to doctrinal differences among Protestant churches. Sorry. The question again?
I was quite curious about what non-fiction you like to read.
Hmm?
What non-fiction you like to read when you're not spending too much time on Reddit?
Not enough, because long-form books... The internet has had a corrosive effect on my attention span. I have the attention span of a ferret on crack. Reading books is difficult. A couple of years ago, I did work my way through Debt, The First 5,000 Years by David Graeber, and got a book out of it, namely Neptune's Brood. It's a book about space colonization and money in a slower than light space opera universe, much slower than light. 1% of light speed is as fast as anyone can go. And consequently, they've evolved a banking sector and an interstellar economy for funding the colonization of new star systems. And our protagonist is a middle-aged historiographer of accountancy practices with a speciality in fraud. And she's on the trail of the biggest ever financial fraud in human history. One so big that they had to... that it triggered a wave of planetary colonizations just to launder the money. They had to colonize new star systems to put it in.
Question.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. That brings me to Paul Krugman and your association with Paul Krugman.
In a moment.
Okay.
On my to read this, I've really got to read Piketty on Capital in the 21st Century. But maybe I can just get by reading all the reviews of it. But Paul Krugman, well, I've only met him a couple of times. What apparently got him interested is he's a science fiction and fantasy fan, as well as a Nobel Prize winner in economics. And he glommed onto the Merchant Princes series because they were asking what he thought were the right questions about economic development. And I probably shouldn't disappear down this rabbit hole too long, but an interesting question to ask is look at North and South Korea. In 1953, North Korea and South Korea were pretty much even. They had both been stomped flat by the Red Army and then the US Marine Corps. The dividing line where the ceasefire was held divided two halves of Korea that had been equally flattened, that were both starting from an equal level of deprivation. They'd been invaded and occupied by the Imperial Japanese for 20 years before the Second World War, and before that they had been one kingdom. Fast forward to the mid-1970s, and photographs of North Korea from the mid-1970s are almost unrecognisable. It was a relatively prosperous Eastern Bloc country. Meanwhile, South Korea was a military dictatorship, and not very prosperous. Again, they were economically roughly even in GDP terms. The real gap began to open from the late 1980s onwards, and somehow, in a period of about 20 years flat, South Korea went from being probably where Thailand was 10 years ago to being richer per capita than Japan. Yeah? Meanwhile, North Korea began going backwards. Somehow, South Korea figured out how to develop, how to do a real great leap forward. Japan did the same thing between 1945 and 1975. They went from being relatively backward and bombed flat into becoming a front-rank economy. For a more spectacular example, go back to Japan in 1856, a high medieval country that has just had the ironclad steam-powered battleships drive into their big harbour, and make the point that you can ignore the outside world, but the outside world isn't standing still and won't ignore you. In the 1850s, Japan didn't have any guns. The shogunate had banned them in the 17th century. They didn't have any steam engines. They were pretty much a stable high medieval society. Yet, by 1906, they fought a major naval battle with a front-rank European power, Russia, and defeated them. Somehow, in just 50 years, Japan went from the Middle Ages to being able to take on a front-rank great power. What causes these development leaps? How do nations develop? We can see it all around us. Look at China today and compare it to China of 50 years ago. Look at India today. India has just put a spaceship into orbit around Mars. This does not fit with any stereotype you have of India through the late 1960s.
And yet 500 million people still don't have a toilet.
Yeah, one of the big economic problems facing China today is how to build first world middle class accommodation for 400 million people in 20 years. That's one of the things they're trying to do.
I mean, I'm an architect, and so I'm pretty involved with what's happening in China. And basically, there's a whole lot of kind of Potemkin villages on gargantuan scale, which are completely unbelievable to Western minds. In a way, but like a whole city, with skyscrapers, housing, completely empty, no one living there. It's just sort of projects to keep the keep people employed, to keep the engine running. But
That sort of
no purpose.
That sort of thing happens elsewhere, though. There is real development going on as well. Japan is.
I mean, it's not just.
We could get.
Mirrors, no?
I could get started on Japan and the concrete industry. I once caught a train from Tokyo to Kyoto, and in Japan you have rice fields of a quarter acre, about a tenth of a hectare, with a 70-year-old farmer maintaining them because rice is important culturally as well as economically. And villages on the side of a hill, and these hills are obviously prone to landslides, and rather than abandon this tiny field next to a hill, next to a cliff, they have concreted up the entire side of a cliff with pre-stressed concrete buttresses to stop it from subsiding over this field. Because the government loves the concrete industry and will throw money at it. And the result is there is infrastructure there that can be used, even if it may look wasteful at first. Sometimes it's very hard to tell the difference between a huge Potemkin village and a whole load of corruption going into creating a ghost town and a project that starts the economy rolling and generates jobs for builders. It's sometimes hard to tell where one ends and one begins. But the whole thrust of the Merchant Prince's books, besides being a parallel universe's adventure yarn, is different cultures that have developed or failed to develop differentially. And this in turn is what got Paul Krugman's attention. Because the question of how cultures develop is intimately connected with the question of what are the origins of prosperity.
Have you read anything by Ha-Jun Chang? Because he's supposed to be the person to read about these things.
I probably should.
I recommend it.
Right. Do we have more questions?
When your next Merchant Princes series comes out?
Okay, there are two things happening with the Merchant Princes series. The first is that it was originally published in the United States as 6 thin fantasy novels. It is now being republished, initially in the UK and now in America, as 3 fat techno-thrillers. They were originally meant to be the fat techno-thrillers, but they were sold as fantasy initially for contractual reasons. These are edited. I have made changes to them. They hopefully read better. The new trilogy I'm working on is almost certainly not going to come out before 2016 now. I've handed in what is hopefully a final draft of Book 1, in which case it could be scheduled for production as early as next November, but I suspect my editor is going to want to mess with it some more, in which case early 2016. However, once it begins to come out, hopefully the entire trilogy will come out within 6 months. This is important because it's really a 1,000-page book in 3 volumes. At least that's how I see it. But early 2016.
I love that series.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, good. I hope you like the next one as well.
if by some evil magic you had to change places for one day with me, and a customer would come in and wanted you to recommend him a science fiction novel or a fantasy novel, which one would you recommend?
Okay, horrible confession time. There are two types. Well, firstly, when I am writing fiction, I find it very hard to read for relaxation, or read the similar stuff for relaxation. About all I can read is stuff that is quite different from what I'm writing. I have therefore been reading very little cutting-edge or far-future science fiction for some years. I am in fact reading far too much urban fantasy, and some steampunk. Just in case this is going to surprise you. Secondly, I don't read terribly fast. I have eye trouble. And as I said, reading after a day of writing is just not that appealing. So I tend to binge on books between projects when I'm not working, and then read very little while I'm working. Finally, it really depends on what the customer in question is looking for, what sort of material. There are so many distinctive subgenres out there within the field of fantasy and science fiction today that I can't guarantee recommending something that everybody will like. There's no such animal, really. If you could narrow it a little to somebody looking for a fantasy or a science fiction title, I could maybe do a bit better, but...
Urban fantasy?
Yeah, who do you like in urban fantasy?
Yeah.
Okay, again, depends on your definitions. Do you want to have something that's challenging and literary, or something that is just brain candy and there's lots of it? If you want challenging and literary fantasies, one of the interesting phenomena that's happening at present in the United States is the barrier between respectable literary fiction authors and fantasy is now breaking down. The fantastic is being rediscovered by serious literary types. The classic type specimen for this is a guy called Lev Grossman, whose novel The Magicians is the first of a trilogy. It's a beautiful deconstruction of Hogwarts, the J.K. Rowling stuff, and the Narnia books by C.S. Lewis. It's also savage and extremely funny, if you like cruel humour.
I thought it was sad.
Yeah.
I thought it was sad.
You haven't read the rest of the trilogy?
Not yet.
Okay. It is worth noting that Lev has a PhD in literature and is the reviews editor for Time magazine. A generation ago, somebody in his position would have been ostracised by the literary community for writing fantasy. Not so much these days. There are other talented literary authors now doing fantasy. Christopher Buehlman, who I hope I pronounce his name right, he's an American literary author, again, doing fantasy. There's a novel of his titled The Necromancer's House, which is... There's a classic type of literary fiction novel, the great American novel, which concerns a middle-aged American university academic, probably an English professor, possibly with sexual dysfunction or issues, a horrible secret in his family history, and he's drinking himself into an early grave while attempting to have an affair with a postdoctoral student, as whatever horrible thing in his past is coming home to haunt him. This is your classic literary novel. Chris Buehlman has taken this standard literary novel skeleton and written a kick-ass fantasy novel structured around it, because instead of it being an English literature professor, it is an aging necromancer. He's having an affair with a hideous undead Russian sea monster, and the dark secret of his past that's coming home to haunt him is Baba Yaga. And it helps if you have the right kind of warped sense of humour to love the idea of a American academic literary novel with necromancers and an undead T-34 tank.
The problem is, for instance, Luke Grossman bombed in Germany. Grossman bombed in Germany full time, and it's unbelievable. They did everything right, and no one reads the book.
Yeah, well, there's no prediction. There's a British author called Ben Aronovich. His Peter Grant series of books, the first of them bombed in America, but went bestseller in the UK. Constable Grant is a Anglo-Caribbean guy from London. He's a police officer, a junior police officer, who can see ghosts. He comes to the attention of the detective running the small and very eccentric Metropolitan Police Station for dealing with magic, and thereafter we go into a series of magic-oriented urban fantasy police procedurals with a very snarky sense of humour. Well worth reading if you like that sort of thing. In a related, there's virtually a subgenre of British police procedural magic stories out there. Paul Cornell's London Falling is the same, only rather grimmer and less humorous. You could say that my Laundry series is the spy thriller equivalent, rather than the police version. Although book 6 goes head over heels into police procedural as well. I've just realised I've been name-checking only male authors. This is very, very bad of me. People you should definitely be reading: Elizabeth Bear, very talented American writer. I believe she has won more Hugo Awards than I have, and she covers she started with a science fiction trilogy, but writes mostly stuff that is pigeonholed as urban fantasy these days. But covers the full gamut. One thing I've noticed is there is less of a tendency to pigeonhole authors by subgenre these days in the American and British markets. There seems to be still over here. You can write fantasy and science fiction and horror. You may have to convince your editors a little, but it is allowed. I have the impression here that once you start writing in one particular form, it's hard to get accepted in another form. Others, trying to think who. Yeah, Sherry Priest. Sherry Priest's Maplethorpe is brilliant. It's Lovecraftian Victoriana, not steampunk insofar as it's historically set Victoriana, and Lovecraftian fiction as well. The infamous alleged murderess Lizzie Borden, who is alleged to have killed both her parents with an axe, but was found not guilty at trial. Well, in Maplethorpe we find out why she killed her parents with an axe, and it involved horrible things coming from the sea. And the Innsmouth look. So Cherie Priest is definitely one. Kat Valente is very much a stylist. It depends what you're reading for. She does literary stylized fairy tales very well indeed, although that is somewhat less my thing. Still worth a look. Anyway, I should perhaps stop name-checking people at this point, because I'm running out of stamina and beer. Yeah, this will help. This will give me a bit more energy. Do we have some more questions?
So, any more questions here? But because you have a lot of talking here by yourself, so
180
I hope you're still able.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. So if we don't have any more questions, Maybe I should talk a bit more about other fiction that hasn't happened.
There is the book that you said that takes place in Berlin.
Pardon?
There's the book that you said that takes place in Berlin.
Bits of the new Merchant Prince's trilogy are set in Berlin.
Of the new one. Okay.
In an alternate future Berlin, I should add. I've always had a yen to write a Cold War spy thriller, so I really wanted the excuse to have a ex-Stasi agent organising a hostage exchange with an American spy at the artificial reality version circa 2020 of the Checkpoint Charlie Museum. I have a warped sense of humour. Some of you have read Halting State and Rule 34, the sequel that is not available in German. There was originally going to be another novel in that series. The trouble is, I got very carried away and over-ambitious in my plans for that novel. Had to put it off for a couple of years. And while I was putting it off, what I call the Scottish political singularity happened. Or rather, began to happen. It's not over yet. Those of you who pay any attention at all to British politics will know that a couple of months ago in Scotland we had a vote on whether Scotland should become an independent country. And the No campaign won by 55 to 45% of the vote. Although since then public opinion has shifted, a lot of people who voted no have changed their minds. Enough that if the referendum was rerun this week it would be a yes vote. I say we're not out of a Scottish political singularity yet. This is because the UK is less stable than most people outside it seem to think. We're going to have a general election next summer that elects the Parliament in London, and it looks as if the Labour Party in Scotland is collapsing, and in fact the third largest party in the government in Parliament after this election is going to be the Scottish Nationalist Party. So anything could happen. We also have the prospect that the Conservatives and the UK Independence Party want to run a referendum on whether Great Britain should leave the EU. Now, it is possible that the English will vote for leaving the EU, but public opinion in Scotland is much more strongly pro-EU. And the current Scottish government have already been laying the groundwork such that if there is a vote, a referendum on whether the UK should quit the European Union, if England votes for leaving and Scotland votes for remaining, it's possible this will trigger another referendum on Scotland leaving the UK but staying in the EU. I can't write a near-future Scottish SF novel in this condition.
Were you allowed to vote?
Yes, I voted to leave the UK.
Why?
I would also vote to stay within the EU. I think... Okay, I am a bit weird politically. My opinions are not mainstream.
I thought there was 10.
But we're different politically. My take is, I think there's a very bad problem with representation of the British people in Parliament, given our current constitutional system. I think that representative governments don't work well in polities of more than about 5 million people. Here in Germany you at least have a federal system. Not only do we not have a federal system in the UK, we have a broken halfway federal system. Scotland has an independent parliament that has devolved power over a lot of local issues, but England does not have a similar parliament. We have a weird situation that's been known as a constitutional anomaly called the West Lothian question for 40-50 years, whereby Scottish MPs can vote on matters affecting England but not Scotland. English MPs don't get to vote on equivalent matters affecting Scotland. Now there's a lot of pressure for Scotland to have more autonomy, effectively federalism. It's something called Devo Max, or devolution to the max. The central government would retain control over foreign affairs and the military, but Scotland would otherwise be autonomous. The problem is, if that happens, what about England? Where does England go? There is actual pressure for England to acquire a federal structure. And nobody really knows where it's going. Basically, the British constitutional system was never designed. It just sort of happened by accident. And there have been a number of patches over the years, and the stresses within it are gradually growing bigger and bigger. So it's anybody's guess what's going to happen in the next few years. I think we would probably be better off as a number of small countries. Also, we'd have more representation on the Council of Ministers in the EU.
I'm sorry, I have to ask a question about this maybe going into this, but do you think the bankers and Theresa May would have gone through on their threats and basically withdrawn all the pensions and withdrawn from Edinburgh and what have you? I mean, it was just a bluff.
It was a
Really
bluff.
nasty
It was a very nasty... There was some very nasty threats made during the independence campaign, but a lot of it was bluffing. I'll tell you exactly why. There is a historical precedent for what happens when a country within the United Kingdom leaves the UK. 1922, Ireland. The constitutional settlement with Ireland is interesting. As a British citizen, I can just move... Well, even without the EU, I can just move to Ireland, buy somewhere to live there, not have to register with the police or anything like that, register to vote in their elections, vote, and after 3 years of paying tax fare, I can get a passport. And the same works the other way round. There's this sort of unlimited reciprocal right of citizenship that's been carried over. Driving from Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland, there isn't even a sign saying you're now in a... No, there's a sign at the roadside saying speed limits now in miles per hour, not kilometres per hour. And that's it.
You forgot the joke about that sign, though.
Mm-hmm.
We have a road sign that is the national speed limit sign, which is just a white circle with a black line across it. And what this sign means is the speed limit is the appropriate one for this road. So the sign just has that, and it doesn't even tell you what the speed limit is. You know.
It's not as bad as the road from England into Scotland, where there is a big sign in front of a bridge saying, "Welcome to Scotland," and just behind the bridge, hidden from view, is a speed camera. But no, a lot of what was going on in the referendum campaign was nonsense and bluff. If you are faced with a constitutional separation, you go with the existing precedent because all the laws are already there. They've been drafted. The bugs have been shaken out over 100 years. You know what to do. The fact is that while they could have played hardball, moved the banks out of Scotland, installed border controls where there's currently just an open road, this sort of thing, the Scottish government would be able to apply leverage in exactly the opposite direction. It would hurt everybody. I think if the vote had gone for independence, a lot of realism would have been rediscovered the next morning.
It would have meant that the rest of the UK would have veered quite dramatically to the right, though, right? Because a lot of UK's lefties are in Scotland.
Not that many.
Not enough to actually influence Westminster election. Well, not once in about the last 30 years it might have.
Yeah, that was another of the threats that kept coming during the referendum campaign. It was, don't leave us, or the Tories will rule us with a whiplash and the iron jackboot of capitalist oppression for the next century. Sort of like a battered spouse telling their children not to move out and leave them on their own with the abuser.
All right.
Sorry.
Any more questions around? Because normally we do Gatherland after 2 hours. We do a break for it because right now Charles had to talk a lot. So, any more questions for the final?
You stated on your blog a while ago that you don't see any sense in using the tropes of superhuman science and the vast universe, exploring all the old science fiction tropes, because as science gets to know the universe better and better and better, it gets more like old fairy tale tropes. So it's I kind of got this idea from your text. I may be wrong.
Yes and no. A few years ago, SF author Jeff Ryman was teaching a class of students about creative writing of science fiction. And they got discussing the existing tropes. And faster than light travel, time travel, handheld death rays, aliens with spaceships, this sort of thing. They began getting the uneasy feeling that we take these tropes for granted. They're part of the wardrobe department of science fiction. Nobody questions them when somebody comes on stage wearing this fancy outfit, or in this faster than light spaceship. Nobody questions where it comes from or its validity. These are not totally implausible, but they are not obviously possible either. They are taken for granted. Now, if the whole purpose of your science fiction is let us posit a particular type of loophole in relativity that allows us to travel faster than light, what are the consequences? That's fine. That's a legitimate use of it. If you are just trying to write a story, though, do you really need this? Is it actually contributing anything, or are you just writing using it as a convenient plot to enable a power fantasy? If you don't have any rational need for it, fiction with faster than light travel and dragons, faster than light spaceships and aliens is not inherently any more plausible than fantasy with dragons and elves. Can we come up with a justification for it? If do we need this to make the fiction believable? And Jeff and his class issued what they called the Mundane Science Fiction Manifesto. And it was a rather austere, self-denying, back-to-basics manifesto, but you should try writing science fiction that is strictly plausible. That is, you don't use implausible or incredible or difficult stuff, or stuff that you can't justify, or if you do, it needs to be just for one item or one or two items, and they're the central focus of the story. You know, there's got to be a reason for having them there. And I find this a very useful challenge when writing science fiction, to see if I can write science fiction that is plausible within these rules. One of the things I did in Saturn's Children was set out to write a space opera that played by these rules. No magic space drives, no bug-eyed monsters, no implausible interstellar travel. And it's actually very, very hard to do it right, but it can be done. I think it's actually more fun to play by the rules and have a universe that is strictly plausible, rather than relying on magic wands to solve all your problems. This does not mean there's no need for and no space for escapist fantasies or space opera. It's just sometimes it's fun to work minimally and try for total plausibility or believability.
Okay, some more questions? If not, I would suggest we close the official part. I think some of you want to have their book signed. That will take a little bit of time. Normally in the Gatherland, we do now a little round who's reading what to get suggestions. But with around 60 people, I think it will take us a little bit along today. So if there is any more questions, I would say let's close the official part and start signing up books. If Charles,
yeah, I'm happy.
Perfect. Thank you very much.